science, technology, and ordered creation. Hand in hand with intellectual formation is the development of science and technology. Here, too, Christianity played a pivotal and paradoxical role. We sometimes hear of an alleged conflict between science and religion, but the historical reality is that Christian belief in an orderly creation was one of the key ingredients in the rise of modern science. Far from opposing the scientific spirit, Christianity helped ignite it. The medieval and early modern scientists were nearly all devout Christians, or at least influenced by Christian assumptions, who believed that in studying nature, they were uncovering God's design. Why did science as a sustained, self-correcting enterprise take root in Christian Europe and not in civilizations like ancient Greece, China, or the Islamic world that had flashes of scientific insight? Historians of science like Pierre Duhem, Stanley Jacqui, and others have argued that unique aspects of the Christian worldview made the difference. First, Christianity taught that nature is not full of unpredictable deities or spirits, but is the rational creation of a rational God. This gave early scientists confidence that nature's laws were comprehensible. As the Bible puts it, God established the heavens and the earth by measure and number, an idea that encouraged the search for precise natural laws. Second, Christianity desacralized nature. In animistic or pantheistic cultures, to probe too deeply into nature's workings could be seen as irreverent or dangerous, but Christians viewed nature not as divine, but as the handiwork of God. That meant one could dissect a body or chart the stars without impiety. One was, in fact, honoring God by studying his work. Third, Christianity's doctrine of creation, ex nihilo, out of nothing, meant that nature had a real, contingent existence with a beginning in time. Unlike some Greek thinkers who imagined eternal cycles, Christians expected linear cause and effect processes established by God's decree, which made them open to discovering new things rather than assuming everything repeated or was illusory. We see these theological principles explicitly in the writings of the pioneers of science. The 17th century astronomer Johannes Kepler, after formulating his laws of planetary motion, exclaimed, "O God, I am thinking thy thoughts after thee." For Kepler, doing astronomy was a way of tracing the patterns the Creator had etched into the cosmos. Galileo Galilei, a devout, if sometimes contentious Catholic, argued that God had given us two books, Scripture and nature, and that correctly interpreted they would agree, since God is the author of both. This conviction emboldened him to explore nature directly, leading to his foundational work in physics and astronomy. René Descartes, a profoundly religious Frenchman, advanced mathematics and analytic geometry under the belief that a rational God made a rational universe discernible by reason. Sir Isaac Newton, who arguably did more than any other single person to establish modern physics, was deeply religious and spent as much time on theology and biblical studies as on science. Newton saw the law of universal gravitation as revealing the elegant clockwork of a divine lawgiver. In the conclusion of his Principia Mathematica, Newton famously marveled at the solar system's order and argued that it could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. To Newton, studying gravity, motion, and optics was, in a sense, an act of worship unveiling the genius of God's design. The litany of devout Christian scientists extends well beyond a few famous names. Throughout the scientific revolution and beyond, the vast majority of natural philosophers, as scientists were then called, were sincere believers. Copernicus, who first proposed heliocentrism, was a cleric. Robert Boyle, the father of modern chemistry, was a passionate Christian who wrote apologetics defending his faith and funded missions and Bible translation. He saw no conflict between examining chemical reactions and glorifying God. Michael Faraday, a giant in electromagnetism and inventor of the electric motor, was a member of a small Christian sect, the Sandemanians, and known for his humble faith as well as his laboratory genius. Gregor Mendel, the Augustinian monk who discovered the basic laws of genetics in his monastery garden, embodies the harmony of vocation between the scientific and the spiritual. Louis Pasteur, who formulated the germ theory of disease and invented vaccines that have saved countless lives, was a devout Christian who often affirmed that his scientific discoveries only increased his awe of the Creator. And the pattern continues. One might note that the Belgian physicist Georges Lemaitre, who formulated the Big Bang theory in the 20th century, was a Catholic priest. He saw his cosmological model as uncovering the moment of creation, let there be light. This lineage of faithful scientists strongly counters the myth that Christianity stifled science. On the contrary, Christianity was the cultural womb that nourished the birth of modern science. It was not just attitudes, but also concrete structures that Christianity provided to science. The medieval universities gave an institutional home for scholars to pursue natural philosophy systematically. It is in these Christian universities that disciplines like astronomy, anatomy, and mathematics advanced steadily through the late Middle Ages. The Church also patronized scientific endeavors. The Gregorian calendar reform of 1582, for instance, was a Vatican project requiring astronomical expertise, led by Jesuit mathematicians and astronomers. The Church's need to set accurate feast days and time of Easter propelled advances in astronomy and mathematics. Many clergy were themselves scientists. In addition to Mendel and Copernicus, we have figures like Marin Mersenne, a friar who made key contributions to acoustics and number theory, and Roger Bacon, a 13th century friar who is often credited with anticipating the experimental method. Far from warring with the Church, early science was often done by churchmen. The notion of conflict largely arises from a few famous episodes, like Galileo's trial in 1633. But even the Galileo affair, while regrettable, was not a simplistic science versus faith showdown as popularly imagined. Galileo had supporters within the Church, and was initially championed by the Pope. The dispute hinged on scriptural interpretation and church politics more than on an inherent opposition to astronomy. In any event, the overall relationship between Christianity and science has historically been collaborative far more than conflictual. The Church encouraged the study of nature as a way to appreciate God's handiwork. As one medieval dictum had it, God wrote 2 books, the Book of Scripture and the Book of Nature. This mentality was pervasive among Christian intellectuals. Indeed, the Christian worldview provided key intellectual assumptions needed for scientific inquiry, that the universe had rational order, that human reason could discern this order, since the same Logos who ordained creation also illumines our minds, and that it was worth doing so. Other civilizations had brilliant minds and made technological strides, but none developed science as a self-sustaining, empirical enterprise like the Christian West did. By the 18th and 19th centuries, even as some scientists became less personally devout, they were still operating within a framework established largely by Christian philosophy. Christianity's contribution to technology is also noteworthy. While technological ingenuity is a human trait found across cultures, the medieval Christian ethos actively promoted tools that alleviated labor and improved life, seeing this as part of humanity's God-given task to cultivate the earth. Monasteries were innovation hubs in the Middle Ages. They were among the first to harness water and wind power on a large scale in Europe. They improved agricultural techniques. The heavy plow, horse collar, and crop rotation spread widely under monastic stewardship of land. They developed timekeeping devices. The mechanical clock has its origins in medieval monastery bell towers, needed to regulate the liturgical hours. The spirit behind these innovations was a Christian ethic that valued productive labor, viewing it as a form of prayer, ora et labora, pray and work, and neighborly service. Improving mills and presses benefited entire communities. Gutenberg's printing press in the 15th century, arguably the most consequential technological breakthrough of the past millennium, was driven by a Christian motive: to make the Bible and other literature widely available. The first book he printed was the Latin Bible. Printing rapidly spread and fed the Renaissance and Reformation, all grounded in the desire to share knowledge. The synergy of Christian mission and technology has been evident ever since. Whether it was the Jesuits mapping the stars of the southern hemisphere, or missionaries in the 1800s building simple printing presses to set native languages to print, the faith has been a midwife to technological progress. To be sure, not every Christian era or community embraced science and innovation uniformly. There were seasons of complacency or even suspicion toward new ideas. The Protestant Reformation initially discouraged the budding science of Copernicus, for example, before Protestants later fully embraced science. Yet the broad trend remained. Christianity laid the intellectual foundation and fostered the social climate for science and technology to thrive. The result was an explosion of understanding and capability that has dramatically improved human life. Longer lifespans through medical science, greater comfort and productivity through engineering, and deeper cosmic insight through physics and astronomy. Thus, in the realm of science and technology, Christianity's contribution was to affirm an intelligible creation and a value in knowing and subduing it for the common good. That conviction propelled centuries of inquiry and invention. Our modern world of medicines, machines, and marvels is in significant measure the fruit of seeds planted by Christian hands. Christianity and the liberating power of business. A natural bridge emerges here because the same Christian confidence that the world is orderly and intelligible did more than inspire laboratories. It also energized the workshop, the counting house, and the trading floor. Business may seem mundane beside lofty pursuits like theology or astronomy, yet it is precisely in everyday exchange that most people participate in culture making. Vishal Mangalwadi presses this point when he argues that the Bible's view of work and property unleashed a distinctive commercial dynamism, one that other great civilizations, for all their brilliance, did not quite match. Consider the mechanical reaper introduced by Cyrus McCormick in the 1830s. At the Great Exhibition in London 2 decades later, the galleries dazzled visitors with ornamental marvels from every corner of the globe: crystal fountains, porcelain pagodas, silks, spices, engines gleaming under gaslight. Set against such splendor, McCormick's iron contraption looked almost embarrassingly plain. Yet the little reaper carried a civilizational punch. One laborer walking behind it could harvest what once required a dozen men with scythes, freeing hands for education, enterprise, and invention. Mangalwadi highlights more than the machine. He spotlights the moral vision that framed its distribution. McCormick offered farmers a novel installment plan: take the reaper this season, pay from next season's enlarged yield. It was a commercial covenant built on trust, the buyer's promise to repay, the seller's willingness to risk, both presupposing a culture in which oath-keeping is sacred. The reaper's success foreshadowed the modern practice of consumer credit that fuels everything from tractors to laptops. Behind it stands a biblical ethic that weds compassion to enterprise, love of neighbor to legitimate profit. Travel back a few centuries, and the same fusion appears in bookkeeping. Double-entry accounting, systematized by the Franciscan friar Luca Pacioli, rests on the deceptively simple insight that every debit must have a credit. That symmetry mirrors the moral clarity of Christian stewardship. Funds are not nebulous but traceable. Gains and losses must balance because God, the ultimate auditor, weighs every scale. Meticulous ledgers cultivated honesty, facilitated partnerships, and enabled large-scale ventures that would have been unthinkable under looser records. Modern corporations, global supply chains, even government budgets depend on the transparency first modeled in monastic counting rooms, intent on giving God a true account. Shift to Northern Europe after the Reformation, and you meet a flood of small innovations propelled by what Max Weber later called the Protestant work ethic, though his explanation was narrower than the reality. Calvinists in the Low Countries reclaimed flooded marshes, built windmills, and spun the world's finest cloth. Puritan merchants in Boston exported fish, timber, and ideas, founding the first stock companies in America. Quaker entrepreneurs in England, Barclay in banking, Cadbury in chocolate, Rowntree in cocoa, Fry in iron, pioneered fair wages, affordable housing, and profit sharing long before governments legislated such things. Their theological conviction that every employee is a brother or sister before God undercut the logic of pure exploitation and introduced industrial paternalism that, despite paternalistic flaws, dramatically improved working conditions. Christianity's gift to commerce is not merely ethical restraint, it is intellectual architecture. Private property, for example, gains its dignity from the commandment against theft, yet it remains bounded by the Jubilee principle, reminding owners that land is ultimately God's. Contract law echoes covenant theology. Words create binding realities, and justice requires honoring those commitments. The very term trust in finance gestures back to a virtue cataloged by Augustine and Aquinas. Even bankruptcy, often maligned, descends from biblical debt release, not a license for irresponsibility, but a humane reset that keeps economic failure from becoming a life sentence. Without such moral and legal scaffolding, sophisticated markets stall under the weight of suspicion. Outside Europe, missionary influence translated those principles into local idioms. In colonial India, Scottish Presbyterian teachers introduced modern commercial arithmetic to Hindu traders. Literacy in ledgers soon empowered indigenous entrepreneurs. In West Africa, Basel mission artisans trained converts to weave kente cloth for both export and proud local identity, seeding a Ghanaian economy that still thrives on small-scale enterprise. In Korea, Methodist and Presbyterian schools produced the chemists and engineers who would later found the conglomerates driving today's technology boom. Wherever gospel and marketplace met, the pattern often recurred: dignity of labor, discipline of accounting, reinvestment of surplus for the common good. The biblical storyline also ennobles creativity itself. God works for 6 days shaping raw chaos into cosmos, then commissions humanity to continue that cultivation. Business, at its best, is a sub-creation, taking grain plus iron plus ingenuity and turning them into bread on every table. That theological backdrop produced the medieval idea of the just price, rejecting both usury and price gouging, and later produced microfinance experiments such as the Reaper installment plan we noted earlier. Modern microcredit champions in the majority world draw knowingly, or sometimes unwittingly, from that precedent. Loans are vehicles of empowerment, not instruments of bondage. None of this implies a flawless record. Christians have participated in exploitative colonial concessions, sweatshops, and speculative bubbles, yet the tradition also generated internal correctives. When Quaker ships profiteered in the Atlantic slave trade, Quaker prophets rose to condemn the practice, and by the late 1700s, the entire Society of Friends had banned slaveholding among its members. When coal magnates in Wales sank wages below subsistence, evangelical revivalists fueled the rise of trade unions demanding just pay. In more recent times, the faith and work movement has renewed attention to vocation, stewardship of the environment, and ethical investing. It is history repeating itself. The gospel challenges its own adherents to reform the marketplace in light of the kingdom. As we survey these episodes, from medieval ledgers to 19th century farm machinery, from Quaker chocolate to Korean conglomerates, we discern a through line. Commercial life flourishes where the biblical trinity of truth, trust, and creativity is honored. Truth in honest weights and true accounts. Trust in covenants that bind seller and buyer. Creativity in ventures that transform raw resources into shared prosperity. For missional leaders today, the implication is clear. If the next wave of artificial intelligence, biotech, or renewable energy is to serve rather than enslave humanity, it will need the same moral ecology. People who see enterprise not as a zero-sum scramble, but as a call to cultivate and bless. Christian history and business offers more than nostalgia. It offers a template and a mandate. With that commercial dimension now firmly in view, we are ready to pivot from markets to mercy and examine how the compassion of Christ institutionalized healthcare and humanitarian relief across centuries and continents.